Rainy night horror stories. The gravel road ended at a chain-link gate and a sign that looked like it had been shot at more than once. Gray Point Acoustics Research. Authorized personnel only. Someone had spray-painted over research and scrawled listening. Beyond the fence, the building hunched on the cliff like a rusted shoebox, its windows narrow as slits. The sea was a black mass beyond it, ragged white lines where waves struck the rocks. Lightning stitched the sky open, and the gate clanged against its post as if trying to clap. I killed the engine and sat with my hands on the wheel. The storm moved in waves of sound, wind clawing through brush, rain tapping on the windshield, thunder thumping a beat under it all. I had seen the listing for a weekend contractor, overnight caretaker, test a few generators, watch the equipment during the storm. Double pay for the weather risk. I'd expected a lighthouse or an empty ranger station. I hadn't expected a decommissioned coastal facility built to listen to everything the sea doesn't want to say. I punched in the code the project manager had texted. The lock buzzed loose, and I dragged my bag across the wet gravel, then across the threshold. The entryway smelled like damp wool and old wiring. The light switches didn't work until I throttled the generator in the shed and felt its grumble under my feet. Banks of fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, and a line of dusty floor tiles pointed toward a corridor with steel doors. Each door wore a taped label in faded, slanted handwriting. Lab A, hydrophones, hydraulics, archive. At the far end was a door painted red, its sign in stenciled letters, lower access. I pushed my wet hair off my forehead and told myself, a storm, a strange building, a couple of checklists, easy money. The office looked like it had belonged to someone who left in a hurry. A mug ring on the desk. A swivel chair pulled back as if someone had just stood up. The wall clock ticked a jagged second hand that stuttered at 12:03 as though it had something to hide. I set my bag down and found the logbook. The last entry was from 6 months ago, all caps, tight letters. Array 3 still picks up anomalous signals during storms. Filters ineffective, requesting perm shutdown. There was a little doodle beside it, a cluster of circles that looked like a flower or a speaker from the wrong angle. The first thunder cracked so close it felt personal. The fluorescents fluttered, the generator coughed and steadied. The sound in the building changed. Walls have voices if you know how to listen. Pipes, ducts, wire runs, ventilation, all of it singing its own little song. But the tone here wasn't the whine of electronics or the hiss of air. It was something felt more than heard. A low pressure, like standing next to a bass cabinet. Thunder rolled, and under that, deeper, there was texture. Something like consonants. I told myself it was the array. This place had once recorded undersea seismic activity, whale communication, maybe even enemy subs when that had mattered. When the storm hit, all of it would light up. The equipment bay still had racks of black boxes with green LEDs crawling like insects. Behind them, a glass wall separated the control room from a space I didn't want to think about. A concrete pit ringed with cables, a mouth with metal teeth. The hydrophone array matched the doodle in the logbook. Circular modules like buds, each wired to the racks, each listening to a different deep. The checklists were practical. Test generator, done. Switch to internal power, done. Inspect waterproofing. The seals around the lower door were cracked. I made a note. Confirm automated logging. The monitor glowed a pale ghost blue, waiting for instruction. I started the run. The speakers burped static, then quieted. For a while, all I heard was the building remembering how to be awake. The first voice threaded itself through a thunderclap so smoothly I almost didn't notice. Help. It was a breath more than a word, stretched long and thin, the syllable caught in the seam where the thunder broke. The speakers throbbed with it, the filters jittering. Lightning flashed, and the lab lit up like a morgue. My reflection in the glass wall looked like someone else. Elbow lifted, headphone cup pressed to my ear, mouth pinched. Test? I said into the room, then laughed at myself. It was nothing. The brain finds faces in walls, voices in wind. A storm was 1,000 instruments at once. But the next peal of thunder brought another eddy of sound, and this one was not a breath. It was a string of syllables. If you've ever listened to a foreign language on a poor connection, your ear picks out the rhythm, the rise and fall, and then, one word you know, clear as a bell, under, please. I set the headphones down gently as if I'd been holding a bird. Radio interference, I said to the room. CB, ship band, whatever. My tongue tasted like pennies. By midnight, the sea and sky were one continuous conversation. The wind bullied the corners of the building. Rain ran down the glass like someone trying to scratch their way through. I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and walk the hall. The red door at the end breathed cold air at my ankles. The seal whistled faintly. I put my palm against the metal and felt the storm on the other side, the whole cliff trembling with it. When I opened the door, the smell came up like a creature: salt, wet metal, old stone. Stairs ran down into dark, and the sound changed again, like stepping into a church when service has already begun. The thunder wasn't above me anymore. It was around me, the stairwell acting like a throat. I descended until the steel groaned under my feet and the handrail numbed my palm. The light down there was the bad kind, emergency bulbs that turned skin the color of candle wax. At the bottom, the corridor yawned left and right. On the right, a sign for intake: do not open during bad weather. On the left, pump room, array cabling. The floor was wet enough to reflect those words back at me, upside down. Something dripped somewhere, steady as a metronome. I was halfway to the pump room when the next thunder wave came, and with it a voice shaped like my name. Lena. I didn't know the voice, not exactly. It wasn't my mother's or any ex's or a friend from university. But it wore their edges the way a stranger can wear the same perfume as someone you loved. The consonants were a little wrong, like someone with a cold was trying. It came through the concrete, a bone-deep vibration. My mouth was dry and still I tasted brine. Hello? I said, ridiculous there in my yellow rain jacket, flashlight cone wobbling. The beam caught looping cables on the wall, slick with condensation. They crawled into the pump room like vines into a ruin. The next roll of thunder turned the room into an instrument. Pipes trembled against brackets. The floor buzzed. I could hear the fluid speech of the intake valves. And under all that, the voice pressed itself into me. Under, it said plainly now. Under, under. Then another voice, layered under the first, like harmony. Not words, just a cadenced plea. I moved toward the intake sign, even as my own voice inside said, no, 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 don't be an idiot. The sign had a wheel on it, red and stubborn. The door was bolted, but it flexed minutely under the storm's pressure, exhaling damp air that smelled like the shoreline at low tide, weed and rot and something sweet I didn't want to identify. I stood with my palm against the metal and realized the mistake I'd been making. The voices weren't in the speakers. They weren't in the air. They were in the building. It's not so unusual. Wind finds a mouth in a chimney and suddenly your childhood home complains to you in vowels. Water in pipes beats like a hand at a door. But there was calculation in this music. The next thunderbolt laid a pattern across my bones, a stuttering, a playback, a rehearsed emphasis. Lena, beat, under, beat, open. I backed away, feet squeaking. My flashlight jittered. The beam caught a smear of something pale near the floor where the door met the threshold. I squatted, and the smell lifted with me, a human salt that cut through the sea's mask. My scalp prickled before the thought formed. It was skin, a flap the size of a fingertip, caught in the seam like something had been dragged through when the door last opened. I fled. I don't remember climbing the stairs, only the feeling that the stairwell had more steps than it had when I went down. The red door hit its frame with a hollow cough. I wanted every lock on it, every chain, but there was only the deadbolt, which I threw, and the pocket of air I held in my lungs like a superstitious child. In the control room, the racks hummed like a hive. The storm had escalated into something frantic, lightning like camera flashes, thunder a continuous cracking roar. The words were clear on the monitors now because the storm's peaks were perfect for them. The building fed it in, and the array fed it back, teeth of metal, throat of air, diaphragm of water. The logbook's doodle looked more and more like a flower meant to trap insects. I put the headphones on again and felt a pressure like a hand around my jaw. There were multiple voices now, and my name lived in each. Low, high, child bright, old leaking. The words didn't line up neatly. They blurred like the reflections in the wet floor, all different mouths trying the same shape at once. And then a familiar voice threaded the storm. My brother, dead 5 years in a winter road accident. Lena, he said simply, it hurts. I took the headphones off so fast the cable whipped me. I was crying before I knew it, a caving-in sob that was mostly anger. The building vibrated a reply that made the mug rattle on the desk. My brother's voice used to sit in my bones like warmth on a cold day. This was a draft named for him. "What are you?" I asked the walls. The storm laughed. "When I was little, I watched a trick on a science show. You can make grains of sand arrange themselves into shapes with nothing but a speaker and a tone. Cymatics. You change the frequency and the pattern changes. Not magic, just physics. Now imagine a coastline, a cavern, the exact geometry of a room, harsh angles, damp stone, air weight, cable tension, water volume, and the hammer of a storm as a striker. If something down there was shaped to speak when struck, if something had learned to make a throat out of corridors and valves and ducts, if something liked what came through when it tasted electricity and salt, the building wanted the intake open. The voices had been trying that door for 6 months, maybe longer. The note in the logbook, requesting perm shutdown, sat in my gut like a swallowed coin. I reached for the breaker panel because it was the only thing I could reach. The array ran on clean power. Noise messed with recordings, and they needed clean data. But if I jammed it, if I could bury the system in white hiss, if I could change the tone just enough, the instrument would twist. The building would forget the shape of my name. I threw the switch labeled aux input. The system protested. Lights changed their minds. The rack's fans spun up, and the room filled with loud, ugly sound, a square wave that felt like chewing aluminum foil. The voices slipped for a second, skidded, then caught on the new rails. "Open, open, open, open," they chattered, too fast and choppy to be language. The breaker thunked. The lights dimmed and came back. The square wave stretched and frayed like cloth. Thunder came in behind it, massive, implacable. The sound throttled the room as if it had hands. From the hall, something banged, the red door breathing. The metal's complaint set my teeth on edge. The deadbolt was stout but old. I saw it in my mind, its guts loosened by years of salt air and inattentive hands. The intake door had skin in its seam. The red door would take my fingers whole. I grabbed the folding chair and wedged it under the door handle because that's what people do in movies, even though it makes no sense with a door that opens inward. It made me feel like I'd chosen something. The next roll of thunder picked up my brother's voice and plucked it like a string. And for a moment I wanted to be a fool. For a moment I wanted to run downstairs and wheel that red valve open and let whatever was under the building have me if it meant one more warm syllable that didn't sound like a pipe cough. Instead, I ran to the generator shed through rain that was more like a curtain than weather. The wind shoved me sideways. The gravel underfoot was a tilted planet. The generator throbbed in its hut like a heart that had been taught to take orders. I yanked the choke, then thought better of it, and did the opposite. I redlined it. The pitch climbed. The entire property felt it. The fence, the gate, the guttering, the thin skins of puddles. The storm blinked lightning at me in disapproval. Back inside, the control room's ugliness had become a tool. The square wave, the generator, the fan belt scream. Together they crowded the storm's hand from the steering wheel. The voices misfired, then stuttered, then tried other shapes like a tongue in a new mouth. "Lina," they tried. A question, a test, a recalibration. "No," I said to the building, to the storm, to the part of me that had moved toward the intake with my hand already outstretched. In the corner of the office, the wall cabinet hung open. Inside, a laminated emergency sequence. "In case of flood risk," it said, and showed a diagram of the lower corridor and the intake. Underneath, someone had taped a Polaroid of the pump room. 3 orange floats, the cables looped tidy. On the back, in ballpoint, "Flood first, doors last." When the next thunder crash rolled in, the speakers sucked in breath to sing my name, and I was already moving down the red door stairs. Plastic poncho snapped around my shoulders. A flashlight clamped in my teeth like a bad idea. It was worse the second time. The stairwell's geometry had learned me. Each step matched some dimension of my stride. The handrail was slick with the same condensation that beaded on my upper lip. When I stepped onto the lower corridor, the voices rounded the corner and met me head on. They sounded like a crowd trying to be a single person. As a group, they formed a sense of gravity, and I leaned toward it without meaning to. It felt like home the way sleep does when you've been awake too long. I turned left, away from the intake, into the pump room. The floats sat in their channel, patient and orange. The flood sequence said, overcrowd the intake with water, overload the pumps, force a shutdown upstream, change the pressure waves. When I hauled the manual lever, the pumps complained like dying animals. The pipes juddered. The water's rush shoved against the intake door in a wet body slam. The voices hiccuped. Someone said a word that wasn't mine, a name I didn't recognize or didn't want to. The crowd re-coordinated and tried again. Open. Eat this, I said, and poured the emergency salt sacks into the feeder where one should never pour anything, because I recognized a superstition when I saw one, and the sea knows salt. The pumps took it. The pressure changed. If you have ever pushed a note too hard and watched a glass crack, you know the look on a sound when it meets its limit. The corridor lost its throat. The intake lost its mouth. The voices stripped themselves raw on the wrong harmonics. They went thin and then thinner until they were the hiss under a cassette tape. Then, for one breath, they found some other tone, a new geometry, and said my name so perfectly I almost dropped the lever. Lena, my brother said, not like a stranger, not like a pipe, but exactly like him. Come under. Lightning hit somewhere so close all the lights went white. The deadbolt upstairs exploded from the frame with a crack like bone. A wind made of salt and weather and want came down the stairwell and shoved me against the pump housing so hard it drove the breath from me. The intake door bulged inward, then sagged back. I thought of the flap of skin. I thought of a mouth closing, lips wet and patient. The wind died in a shudder, like a giant animal settling. Then, silence. Not total. Storm, generator, my heartbeat, but silence in the place where the building's voice had been. I stood in the pump room until the flashlight burned a hole in its own battery and went to a weak blue that made everything a dream. I laughed then, ugly and raw, like a tire losing air, because the other choice was to cry again. Upstairs, the red door hung crooked. The chair I'd wedged under the handle lay in two halves, its metal legs twisted into question marks. The logbook had fallen open to the page with the doodle. The ink had bled in the damp until the little flower looked like an iris, a pupil and all. I wanted to take the page and burn it, but there wasn't a thing in the building that wasn't wet. On the drive back up the access road at dawn, the storm retired into the horizon like a king displeased with the theater. The sea on the left was mottled slate, the white lines of waves more like breath than impact now. I kept the radio off. I kept all the windows closed. The world had something to say, and I didn't care to hear it. When I finally swung into my apartment parking lot, the storm was a rumor, distant thunder stitched lightly into the morning. The hallway carpet smelled like last night's cooking. The elevator dinged like a polite guest. In my living room, the refrigerator hummed its stupid two-note hum. I dropped my bag and let my forehead rest against the cool glass of the window. Far out over the city, thunder rumbled again, one long belt of sound that turned under itself like a loop. Between its smooths and roughs, if I peeled back enough layers, if I listened with the part of me that had leaned toward the intake with my hand already out, I swear I heard my name. I turned the kitchen tap all the way on and let the water run until it drowned the worst of it. Then I did all the little human things you do to stitch yourself back together. Showered, ate toast, stood in the sunlight like it owed me something. I told myself with a voice I trusted that geometry only counts in certain rooms, that music only plays if there is an instrument for it, that the building at Gray Point was a throat that needed a storm to speak. At 3 a.m., the next night, the sky over the city flickered without thunder. Heat lightning, they call it, as if giving a name were the same as closing a door. I lay in bed and listened to the apartment breathe. Pipes ticked. The fridge took a hitching breath. Someone upstairs turned in their sleep. Somewhere behind the drywall, deep in the ribs of the building, a duck coughed like a person politely clearing their throat. Lay, it tried, and the word broke. I got up, went into the kitchen, and left the tap running. It felt petty and wasteful and necessary. I watched the stream settle into repeating ripples, their pattern changing when I leaned in. I wondered, not for the first time, whether I had saved myself or taught something old a new shape. Whether the pumps and the salt and the humming ugliness had warded off a storm forever or tuned my life to a frequency I would never be rid of. In the morning, when the sun came up clean and stupid, I turned off the tap and listened. The building did not say my name. The city did not sing. The air tasted like nothing again. I made coffee with water that had not learned me. I sat at my table and wrote the report I knew they wouldn't read, ending with this sentence in red pen: do not open anything when it thunders. Whether they will listen or not is a different story. Whether the thing beneath the thunder has learned a little patience, learned to use the shapes we make when we build our rooms and say our names out loud, is something I try not to consider. Sometimes when a storm rolls in and the first low guitar string of the sky hums my windows, I run all the faucets. Sometimes I stand in the doorway to my bedroom and hold my breath. And sometimes, when a far-off car backfires, perfectly timed to the rumble overhead, I hear a word in the seam of those sounds, my name stretched long and thin, and I remember how it felt to put my hand on that door and want, against all sense, to open. I moved into the building on a Thursday evening, under a sky the color of old tin. The rain had already been falling for hours, the kind that doesn't drum so much as hiss, a million soft needles threading the air. My boxes got heavier with every trip from the car, the cardboard fattening and weakening at the seams. The stairwell smelled of damp wool and some kind of oil, linseed maybe, that bled from the wood banister when I ran my palm along it. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, a sublet I'd found through a friend of a friend, above a street-level shop whose warped window bore the words, A. Vandermeer & Sons, repairs, parasols, canes, fine leathers. By the time I hauled the last box up the last step, my hair was slicked to my scalp and my shirt clung cold to my spine. I paused at the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors and noticed, for the first time, a stand of umbrella pegs screwed into the wall like a row of iron fingers. Most were empty. One held a single umbrella. It was black, not glossy. Its fabric had the matte depth of raven feathers. The handle was curved bone, not carved but polished to a softness that seemed greasy. Not the slime of neglect, but the sort of sheen an object gets when too many hands have held it for too many years. I didn't register the oddness then, only that it was not mine and that I was dripping on the floor. The building's vestibule had no light switch I could find, just a pull chain that clicked but did nothing. From the street, the shop's window glowed honey yellow. Brightness pooled on the floor like something you could step into and drown. Above, the 3rd floor hallway yawned, gray and unlit, a rib of shadow stabbing toward my door. I set the last box inside, kicked off my shoes, and listened to the rain. It had a strange 2-part rhythm in this old place, the external hiss and the internal tick. Hiss for the world, tick for the house. Somewhere inside the walls or deep in the ceiling, the tick marched like a metronome. Not a leak, not a clock. I told myself it must be the radiators cooling, though the radiators were cold as tombstone. I didn't own many things. I liked that about myself. I placed a ceramic mug on the counter. I set 2 plates in the cabinet. The enormity of the night swelled around these small acts, and something in me steadied. This was what I'd wanted. A clean shift into a neighborhood where no one knew my name, and the only history was the weather's. When I turned toward the door, the threshold was wet. It wasn't the casual damp of carried-in rain. It was a dark ellipse, perfectly curved, as though the hatch of a submarine had opened above and spilled sea from a separate world. I put my hand to it and felt the chill of true water, recently pooled. Droplets had climbed the wood, high enough to glimmer on the lower hinge. I checked the ceiling for leaks. I checked my hair, my shirt, my shoes. I checked the seals around the door. The hallway beyond showed no puddle, no trail, only the soft gray carpet and the vague imprint of my footsteps. Still, there was no source for the ellipse. I wiped the water with a towel and closed the door. That was when I heard a click from the hall. The soft, breathy sound a mechanism makes when it decides to move. "Hello?" I said, because people say that when they want to remind the air that they exist. There was no answer. The rain hissed. The interior tick counted time. I locked the door and told myself to ignore the way my heart had tapped in with its own little rhythm under my ribs. Click, click, like something trying to raise its head. By 10, the rain had thickened into a roar. I lay in bed with my boxes like small sleeping animals at my feet. The apartment creaked and sighed as the wind shouldered it. I could smell petrichor, wet earth, broken asphalt, the green ghost of crushed leaves, even though every window was shut. The aroma seemed strongest near the kitchen, which made no sense. I went to check. There was a smear on the linoleum, the shape of a crescent moon. Not a stain. Nothing was discolored. It was darker because it was soaked. I touched it and my finger came away wet. I should have gone downstairs to tell the landlord, but I'd never met the landlord. The sublet had been handled by email with someone named Hester. The key had been left under the fourth floor's doormat with a note, "Welcome. Be sure the hallway umbrella stays where it belongs." I had read the line as an oddity, a quirk like the heavy scent of oil in the stairwell. Now the words folded through my mind, "Stays where it belongs." From the kitchen, I could see the front door. The hinge was dripping again, slow and deliberate, one bead of water catinating after another. Each droplet swelled, trembled at the lip of the metal, then let go. The tick in the walls seemed to align with the fall. Tick, drop, tick, drop. "It's a leak," I told the empty apartment. "Just a leak." It wasn't. There was no water line near that hinge, no pipe there at all. I would learn this later, but something in me understood it already. The wetness came not from above or from within, but from elsewhere, drawn to the door as iron to a magnet. At midnight, I gave up on sleep and made tea. Steam fogged the window above the sink. I rubbed at it with my sleeve and found, to my surprise, a shape already traced there. A little umbrella, the outline crude and childish, as if a fingertip had skated through condensation to draw it. Under the umbrella's arc, 3 short downward strokes. Rain. I watched the glass, breath shallow. The teabag string trembled against the mug. The drawing didn't fade, not immediately. It persisted as though the warmth of the traced lines sank deeper into the pane, lightless like old scars. When I opened the door just a crack to check the hallway, a smell blew in. Wet wool, wet dog, wet pennies. And underneath, inexplicably, the very faint sweetness of laundry bluing, the scent my grandmother's closets had carried when I was small. The carpet was dry. The building was asleep. The iron pegs of the umbrella stand glinted in the dim. The black umbrella was not where I'd first seen it. It now hung from the peg closest to my door. I stared at it, jaw tightening the way muscles do when they want to pretend the body is stone. The bone handle leaned toward me slightly, like the head of a long-necked bird listening. It could have been a trick of light and shadow. It could have been that the handle's curve felt like a gaze because I was primed for it to feel like a gaze. But I was sure it had moved. That certainty arrived without evidence and rooted itself. The note's instruction jogged through me again. Be sure the hallway umbrella stays where it belongs. The phrase implied a place, not the stand, not any peg, where it belongs. How was I supposed to know where that was? I should have shut the door. Instead, I stepped into the hall and reached for it. The bone handle was cool and then warm, as if my touch had woken a memory in it. The fabric was not fabric, not exactly. My fingertips felt a very fine, almost downy texture, like the nap inside a winter coat. The umbrella was heavier than I expected, weighted as if the ribs were steel and the shaft thick with mercury. I almost set it down again, but a sudden draft came up the stairwell with the smell of the street, and the old fear that had dogged me since childhood, that things have names and rules and if you follow them you'll be safe, pushed me to act. I decided the umbrella must have belonged on the landing between the second and third floors. That was where I'd first noticed it. That must be where it belonged. I carried it down one flight and hung it on the middle peg. When I did, the ticking in the walls paused. Not stopped, paused, as if the house had taken a breath. Stay. I said to the umbrella, like you'd say to a dog, and felt ridiculous. On my way back up, a shadow lifted at the corner of the stair. No, not lifted. Stepped back, as if the black of the stairwell had withdrawn a foot to let me pass. I slept for a while. Not long. Long enough for the rain to shift timber, for the trees outside to slap their leaves against one another like a congregation clapping. When I woke, the apartment was colder, the kind of cold that crawls out of a pond. The wet ellipse had returned to the threshold, larger now, and a new crescent glimmered by the baseboard across the room, as though the water had traveled there under the skin of the floor and bulged up. I turned on the lamp. The bulb stuttered. In the fluttering light, a figure stood in the kitchen doorway. You're thinking a man. I was thinking that too. A burglar. a neighbor drunk and confused, but there was no shape to it that I could call a body. It was the negative of a body, a careful absence the light tried to fill and failed. The edges of the absence dripped. When I grabbed the lamp and tilted its beam, the edges shivered like heat above asphalt, and the absence stepped back, then was gone. For a long minute, I listened to my own blood in my ears. The apartment ticked. The rain roared. Far below, a metal grate rattled as if a delivery truck had rolled over it. The smell of wet wool came back, stronger, and with it the faint bluing sweetness. "Who's there?" I asked the air, because some questions live as muscle memory in the throat. The reply came as a sound I didn't recognize, the oldest sound, the whisper of a crowd under umbrellas, tight together, moving, their footfalls muffled by rain. Except it wasn't outside. It was right here in the room, many people coordinating without speaking, a choreography of shifting fabric and soft, patient breath. I turned the knob of the front door. It wouldn't give. For a terrible second I thought it had swelled in the damp, but the bolt slid clean. The door itself was held as if something on the other side was leaning against it, something that lately had been water. I shoved. The door opened an inch, then another. Cold poured in. The hallway was dark, but I could make out the stand of pegs, empty. The umbrella had moved again, not to my door this time. It leaned against my threshold, as if something exquisitely polite had left it there for me. I should have closed the door. I should have left it where it belonged. Instead, I took it up, and in that instant, an impossible hush fell. The hiss of the rain outside became a distant thread. The tick within the walls stilled. The very air seemed to condense, and the space beneath the umbrella's canopy, though I hadn't opened it, felt altered, protective, occupied. I hadn't unfurled the thing, but there was a sense of roofing above me, of a circle drawn around my head where the world was bent and narrowed. I didn't open it. I couldn't have. The apartment was small. The idea of wielding its breadth inside felt obscene. But the umbrella knew the gesture, and it wanted it. The bone handle pressed into my palm as though it were a spine trying to nest deeper into my hand. Somewhere beneath the street, a storm drain growled. The crowd whisper of umbrellas swelled again, this time not from the room but from the stairwell, coming up, coming toward me. The scent of bluing intensified, bright and piercing, as if a blue flame had been lit behind my eyes. I backed into the apartment, the umbrella tight to my side, and the door closed by itself with a click like the punctuation at the end of a sentence. Whispering. Not words. A secret spoken before language. Something moved through the room without pressure, as a shadow moves across the back of your eyes when you rub them too hard. The wet crescents on the floor bulged again, mapping the path of a river that had never existed, sluices of elsewhere opening and closing. The umbrella twitched. It wanted two things at once, to be opened and to be held closed. My arm ached with the little jerks and pulls. Every rib, mine not the umbrella's, felt counted. A thought slipped into my head like a hand, and I didn't know if it was mine. Under is safe. Under is ours. Under you belong. Not mine, I said aloud, and my breath fogged the shade of the lampshade as if it were glass. You're not mine. The umbrella pivoted in my grip, trying to turn the crooked beak of its handle into the curve of a question mark around my wrist. I yanked. Its tip scraped the floorboards with the sound of a knife across a plate. Footsteps, soft and numerous, circled the bed. What had I brought up the stairs? Not an umbrella, not a tool for rain. A room, a portable room of absence. A shelter for something that had no business in rooms made by people, that had learned shelter from watching us, how we tuck under awnings, how we huddle beneath canvas and plastic domes that separate weather from skin. It had learned our rule and inverted it. Not keep the rain off, keep the world out. Maybe that's what Vandermeer and Sons sold now. Not repairs, not parasols. Doors. The bone pressed harder into my palm, and I realized it wasn't polished by hands. It was polished by faces. People had bowed their heads to it, pressing cheek and temple in gratitude or pleading. The blue scent was unbearable, metallic laundry on snow, a scent that spoke of whitened cloth pulled too long over cold mouths. You can't have me, I said. My voice shook. I'm not yours. The umbrella tugged, not hard, just insistently. I saw, in the glaze of the bone, a reflection that wasn't mine. It was as if a different room had been reflected there, a hall of old stone, dark water creeping up its steps, footprints on the steps. Mine, not mine. The line wobbled and the reflection wobbled with it. In the bone's shine, a small figure stood under an opened umbrella, but the shadow it cast on the wet stone had 2 heads and too many legs. I can't explain how I knew, but suddenly I did. The umbrella had an owner. You couldn't see the owner, not because there was nothing to see, but because the owner lived in the space the umbrella made, the negative carved out of ordinary air. Whoever that was, their name was in the bone, even though no carving showed. The device of ownership wasn't ink or etch, it was seepage. The name rose in my mouth, slow as a bubble, Hester. The umbrella stopped moving, just for a second. In that second, I wrenched open the front door. Rain blew in like the breath of a god. The world rushed back, hiss, slap, roar, and the tick in the walls restarted at a gallop. The umbrella lurched toward opening, desperate for its heaven of privacy, and I gave it what I had not wanted to give. I ripped its catch and let it bloom. Silence, immediate and complete, descended under the canopy. The sound of the rain remained at the rim like applause beyond a closed curtain. Inside that dome, space tightened. I stood on the threshold, 1 foot in the downpour and 1 under the hush, and felt the most horrible intimacy. Something stepping up to me from the other side of the umbrella's room, putting its unseen hands to my cheeks, like a lover who has at last found you in a station crowd. I did the only thing left. I stepped backward into the rain, hard. I let the umbrella's canopy shear against the edge of the door, catching on the latch, and in that ripping movement the bone handle twisted out of my grip, and the fabric tore with a sound like paper drowned. The ribs inverted with a metallic scream. I threw it. I threw it into the hall, and the rain snatched whatever quiet clung to it and battered it flat. Water pelted the floorboards, and the wet crescents merged, spread, and then went thin and thinner until they were nothing but darkened wood, the way dark lingers behind the eyelids after you look at the sun. The whispering stopped. The smell of bluing faded to a barely there ghost that I sometimes catch when I open a cabinet months later. I stood there shivering, hair streaming, heart hammering as if it would bruise my ribs from the inside. The hall was empty. The umbrella lay face down in a contortion of snapped ribs and unraveled fabric, turned inside out like a creature's mouth. I picked it up with 2 fingers. It was lighter now, hollow almost. I carried it down to the landing where I'd first seen it and hung its broken form on the middle peg. By morning the rain had washed the city into something clear and thin as glass. Light pooled in the shop window below. The sign looked newly gilt. The stand of pegs held no umbrella. The hallway smelled of oil and old wool and nothing else. An email waited in my inbox from the friend of a friend. Subject, moving out. The message was brief. Hester says please return what's hers to the stand. If you can't, leave the apartment. There was no signature, no welcome. Just the implication that my continued presence depended on obedience to a rule I had not understood until I broke it. I wrote back, it broke. I'm sorry. The send button felt like the closing of a coffin lid. I didn't get an answer. Not that day. Not ever. I stayed. I paid rent. I learned the new rhythm of the house and its tick. Sometimes, late, when the city's pulse thins and the storm drains begin to sing, I hear the rustle of fabric outside the door, a gentler sound than conspiracy and a little more than weather. It passes. It always passes. This morning, months later, the rain came again. I went down for coffee, and on my way back, a stranger stepped into the vestibule and shook water from a black umbrella. It was glossy, not matte, and the handle was cheap plastic. He tapped it against the floor, spattering the tiles, and when he saw me, he smiled a neighbor's smile. Some storm, he said. Some storm, I agreed. He reached to hang his umbrella on the iron pegs, then seemed to think better of it. He took it with him up the stairs. His shoes made no sound on the carpet. For a second, just as he rounded the turn toward the second landing, he paused and bent his head to the handle, as if listening for a small voice ensowled there. Not mine, I said softly into the empty vestibule, a private charm. Not mine. When I reached my floor, a new umbrella was on the peg by my door. Black, matte. The bone handle gleamed as though polished by the lives of other people. No water pooled under it. No scent rose from it. It looked like a harmless piece of weather's furniture. I do not touch it. I do not move it to where it belongs. I have chosen for now to live with the tension of an object on the edge of my life that is waiting for me to acknowledge it, or perhaps to appreciate that I do not. The world is full of things that want to be used, and I have learned that the act of using can open a door you will not be able to close without tearing the door from its hinges. Sometimes, when the mist sticks to the glass and leaves little droplets like a second sky, I draw an umbrella in the fog with 3 short strokes underneath. It wipes away easily if you do it right away. The longer you let the lines sit, the deeper they seem to sink into the pain. I keep a towel by the threshold. I sleep with shoes near the bed, and on nights when the rain turns from hiss to roar and the stairwell smells like old closets and wet steel, I lie awake and listen for the moment when the tick in the walls holds its breath. Because that's when you know something is on its way to the door, carrying weather with it and the idea of a room you could slip into and never quite leave. The first thing that struck me when I opened the chapel door was how the rain already lived inside it. It was everywhere, not as a flood, not as puddles, but as a smell and a sound. The smell was of damp wood and cold stone long swollen and aching. The sound was a patient tapping, an orchestra of drips hitting things they shouldn't. It had been raining for 4 days along the coast, a sullen gray sheet that never seemed to end. The county had sent me because I took jobs no one else wanted, and because I could catalog 200 years of storm damage without complaining that I was the only warm body on site after sundown. I kicked the door shut behind me. The iron latch clanged like a bell. Generator hummed from outside. Pale light stuttering through the warped glass. The old chapel on the hill had been deconsecrated a decade ago, then repurposed as a storage hall for exhumations during the cemetery renovations. The sign out front said "closed due to storm" in red paint, which someone had underlined 3 times and then abandoned to the weather. Inside, rows of coffins stacked like books, wooden and metal, tagged with names handwritten in heavy black marker, tarps slung over racks, plastic bins full of plaques, a tangle of folding chairs, and the tapping, tapping, tapping. "Okay," I said to nobody, because the echo of my voice made the place seem less predatory. "This won't take long." My job was simple: record the identification markers on each coffin, photograph them, enter any damage noted, and make sure nothing had been compromised. The caretaker, a man with a red scarf and anxious eyebrows, had met me at the gate, breath fogging, keys rattling. "Storms loosen the roof," he'd said. "You'll hear it, the rain. It's worse at night." "Why at night?" He'd only pressed the chapel keys into my hand like a prayer, then waved me off with a half bow and a promise to check the generator in an hour. I watched him go, a hunched, dark comma swallowed by the rain, and told myself that he was just the kind of man storms built out of salt. Inside, I set my thermos at the far corner of the altar, which had been converted to a work table. I laid out my clipboard, camera, and the county's standard-issue laminated inventory sheet. The overhead light flickered once, and then settled into a constant, sickly glare. The chapel was a narrow shoebox, vaulted ceiling rising into gloom. A hole the size of a dinner plate sagged in the far corner where shingles had slipped. Beneath it stood the cause of that patient tapping, an open coffin, empty, angled to catch the slow bleed of water from the ceiling. Every drop rang the wood like a fingertip on a hollow door. I wrote down the first 5 names and moved along the aisle, calling them out under my breath as if reciting: Marquez H., Pendry L., Singh P., Duplessis M. The tags were tied with frayed string to handles and crossbars, some curling at the corners from damp. My boots whispered over grit. When rain gusted, the roof popped like an old lung taking a breath. Calm moments mattered. That's what I'd learned doing this work. You counted them out and banked them, because the noise would come sooner or later. A wind shriek that sounded like a voice. A misstep that jarred your bones and made your heart trip. You stayed steady and never let the little startles stack up to something larger. Half an hour in, the first strange thing happened. It was small, a nothing. A paper tag fluttered from a coffin I was sure I had already marked, and when I went to secure it, I found the name had changed. Faded ink beneath the fresh, K. Moretti, overwritten by a thicker, newer line that read K. Morley. I took both names down with a note. I took a picture. Tag, string, box, shrugged, untied, retied. The discipline of the method moved me forward. A few aisles over, I heard the chapel bell. The rope had been cut years ago. I knew that because one of the county memos had mentioned a vandalism incident. The bell had been left as a decorative relic with no clapper. But from somewhere above the choir loft came a single, melancholy peal, as if a heavy hand had pushed the bronze and then let it go. The sound vibrated the air like a struck tuning fork. I stood inside it and felt it pass through my teeth. Wind, I told the empty chairs. Wind does weird things. I kept working, pausing only to take a sip of lukewarm tea and to rub feeling back into the fingers I hadn't realized were cold. The rain intensified. The tapping became a quicker murmur, then a staccato, and the hole over the empty coffin widened with a wet, slow tear. Water dappled the coffin's interior, darkening the wood. A shallow pool grew, black as ink in the bad light. That was the second strange thing. I don't know why I kept looking at that particular coffin, why it drew my eye like a magnet. It had no tag, no marker, no stenciled white numbers on the side. It was simply there, open, throat to the ceiling, drinking. I moved away from it. I did my job. When I reached the aisle near the altar again, my radio crackled. It was on the table next to the thermos, set to the county dispatch channel. I hadn't touched it since I'd arrived. Now it hissed and popped, the kind of unruly static that has shape to it, almost a pulse. The hair on my arms lifted as if the room temperature had dropped 5 degrees. Say again? I keyed the mic, surprised by the relief I felt hearing my own voice transmitted in miniature. It made me feel connected to something outside. This is Hall in the chapel. Come again. Hiss. Pop. A whisper layered inside the static, and then very softly my name. Claire. I didn't answer. I didn't like the way the syllable elongated, like someone saying it through water. I turned the volume down until the radio became a faint insect and slipped it into my coat pocket. The silence that followed was worse, if anything, so I took another swallow of tea and forced myself to look down the central aisle again. A shadow crossed the far door. A figure, maybe, there and gone, so quickly I questioned whether I'd seen anything at all. I raised a hand without thinking, as if to wave, and dropped it again, embarrassed by the reflex of wanting to be seen. "Hello," I called. "If that's you, I'm almost finished. Another hour." No answer. Only rain and the generator humming its steady, indifferent song. Work. Keep moving. I doubled back to a coffin I had skipped. The wood on this one was so old the grain rose like sleeping muscles. When I tried to wipe the tag clean with my sleeve, the string snapped. The tag toppled into my hand. Names were written on both sides. The top read S. Trenholm. Flipped, the bottom read C. Hall. My own last name, printed in block letters across the underside, the marker line slightly smeared as if written quickly. I went very still. The normal world retreated. The damp smell, the murmuring taps, the rasp of my own zipper, as if someone had drawn a thin veil between myself and everything else. It was a prank, I decided. Someone had seen my name on the invoice and thought it would be a laugh. The caretaker with his red scarf, a bored county clerk with a marker. A drop of water struck the back of my neck. I reached up to wipe it away, and my fingers came back streaked dark. Not blood. The roof was disgorging flecks of tar or rot with each drop. It had painted a trailing line down my scarf like a black tear. I turned to the open coffin in the corner with a feeling that wasn't curiosity exactly, but gravity. I felt pulled. By then the pool inside the coffin had grown deep enough to catch reflected light. The surface wobbled glassy with each new bead. I took a step closer. Rain dripped through the hole like a metronome, and every tap landed with the precise insistence of knuckles on a door. Don't, I thought. I did anyway. I leaned over the rim and looked down. What I saw was my face, broken into a dozen ripples, pallid with chapel light. My mouth was pressed in a line, the chapped corner split. My eyes had the pinched look they got when I clenched my jaw too long. I smiled at myself like a child to break the tension, and the mouth in the water did not smile back. It opened. Not wide, not all at once. The lips parted just enough for water to spill over the edges of teeth that didn't belong to me. The pool dimmed around the edges as if a cloud had covered a sun that did not exist. I stumbled back and hit the side of another coffin hard enough to bruise. The radio in my pocket exhaled. "Ire. Claire." "Stop," I muttered to the radio, to the roof, to my own heartbeat as it began to hit harder. The generator outside hiccuped and recovered. I listened to the air and heard something new braided inside the storm, the suggestion of breath. The chapel's heavy door creaked faintly, even though I had locked it. Above me, wood flexed. I saw it rather than hearing it. The ceiling boards bowing as if someone walked on them with careful, measured steps. A patter, a pause, a patter. It mapped a path toward the corner, toward the open coffin. And then, so delicately I could almost pretend, the tiniest indentation appeared in the water's meniscus. A fingertip touch. The caretaker's key scraped at the lock. Relief exploded through me like oxygen after surfacing. I was moving before the sound resolved itself into a thought. I threw the bolt, yanked the door wide, and rain bullied its way in like an impatient guest. The caretaker stood there with his red scarf soaking into rust, water beaded like mercury on his lashes. "Don't," he started, and then caught sight of the open coffin over my shoulder. He hissed something in a language I didn't know and made a warding motion with his hand. "You weren't supposed to be here tonight. I have authorization." He shook his head hard enough that water shook free. "Not authorization," he said. "Permission." Lightning grinned over the sea beyond the hill. In that split second of cold white light, every shadow inside the chapel seemed to jump 1 inch closer to us. The caretaker grabbed my arm with surprising strength and tugged me away from the door. He shoved it closed on the rain as if pushing a body back into a grave. "You need to go," he said, "before it gets your name in its mouth." I remembered the tag, my name printed beneath someone else's. The echo of my name on the radio gurgled thinly, the reflection that didn't mirror me. "What is it?" I asked. I was aware of my voice scraping raw. "What am I looking at?" He inhaled, and in that breath I heard the long history of people who live near water and learned to make offerings to it. "We pull them up," he said, nodding toward the closed coffins. "We move them so the hill won't slide and swallow them. We tell them where they're going. Most listen. Some don't, and some—" He looked toward the empty coffin where the tapping had sharpened into a private hunger. "Some are rain. Some are only ever rain. You're talking like it's a thing." He squeezed my arm once, then let go. "Look," he said. We did. The pool of water in the open coffin had grown enough that the tap of each drop made only a soft kiss. The surface changed, not from a drop, but from beneath. A ripple grew with intent. A feature swam up, a brow like mine, a cheek like mine, that not smile mouth opening slowly. The water was learning my shape from the air and the glass and whatever name the radio had whispered into it. "Shut it," the caretaker said. I stared at him. "It's a coffin. It's not a door." "Everything is a door if the weather wants it." He moved toward it. He didn't run. He didn't lunge. He approached with an anger that was almost tenderness, like a father who loves a child that bites. He reached for the lid and stopped. The water bulged. Something pushed against its surface from inside, and the bulge traveled like a hand dragging along under a thin sheet. It reached the rim. It reached the lip. The water climbed just past edge height and held there, trembling, a mercurial finger hovering over the floor. It dripped. The drop struck my boot and soaked in. The radio said my name again, confidently now, delighted. The caretaker shoved the lid down hard. The sound was obscene, a smack of wet wood sealing wet wood. He threw his weight onto it. The water inside struck back, a muffled thud like a fish in a bucket. He looked at me, eyes wild. "Nails," he gasped. "There's a kit." I was already moving, sliding on damp stone, fumbling through bins until I found a rusted, blessed packet of long nails and a hammer that had lived too long in somebody's shed. The caretaker kept the lid down with both palms and forearms, as if warding off an embrace. I set a nail and swung. In movies, the first blow sinks the metal half its length with a satisfying shunk. In real life, wood is stubborn, and my hands were shaking. The first swing went sideways. The second bit with a shriek. The third found rhythm. I drove the nail home with 5 more hits and moved to the next. The water pounded back. We worked around the lip, the caretaker's breath turning ragged in near time with my hammer swings. "Faster," he said. "It remembers quicker the longer it listens." "What does it remember?" "You." The last nail went home. The caretaker slumped back against the aisle. I stood with the hammer hanging from my fingers like a bone. The tapping was gone. In its place was a slower, wetter sound. Water worrying wood, a muffled mouth, the scrape of something learning to be teeth. Outside, the rain went from deluge to drizzle as if a hand had pinched a hose. The generator's hum steadied. The radio in my pocket fell quiet. Calm swept over me so fast my knees went weak. I lowered the hammer to the floor and laughed, a thin thread of laughter that hurt my throat. The caretaker touched my shoulder. "We have to take it down to the crypt," he said quietly. "Before morning, when the sun hits, when it warms." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I could picture the woods softening, the water seeping out in tiny, clever tongues, finding seams. "Whose tag was on it?" I asked. "Before it was empty." He looked at me like a man measuring a rope. Then he walked to my work table, flipped through my clipboard pages, and found the blank spot where I'd written nothing. He set the stack down and returned to the coffin, running one finger along the nails as if checking a fence line at night. "It wants the newest mouths," he said. "Names spoken with heat still on them. The living always sound better. Rain likes a fresh voice." "Then why mine?" He lifted his red scarf to wipe his face, leaving a smear of black, and didn't answer. Instead, he bent as if to lift one end of the coffin. "I'll get the dolly," I said, because task talk kept me from listening to the wet, small shifts inside. At the door, I hesitated. The rain had tapered, but the world was still a blurred study in silver. The hillside fell away into darkness and the grumble of the sea. When I cracked the door and stuck my head out, cool air washed my face clean for the first time all night. I breathed in something that wasn't wood rot and radio static and old paper. On the stoop lay a laminated card, half-soaked and gleaming. It had been nailed to the sign out front, Rescue Services, along with contact information and a warning to avoid the cemetery slope. The card had come loose, and the rain had carried it to the chapel threshold like a delivered message. I picked it up without thinking, and as I did, it turned in my hands like a fish. The backside bore a list of the week's emergency calls in black ink, the names of victims anonymized by initials. On the last line were two initials, not anonymized. My name, in full. Claire Hall, found roadside after a skid into water. Timestamp 7:40. I had arrived at the chapel at 18:10. The air inside my head thinned to something brittle. I stepped back inside, closed the door slowly, leaned my forehead against the wood like a penitent. The caretaker watched me with that same measuring look, then nodded once, as if I had reached a conclusion he'd expected. "You're not dead," he said. It wasn't a comfort, it was a diagnosis. Not yet. The rain hears you from both sides when that happens. The coffin is only the mouth it made. Something inside the nailed coffin dragged fingernails down the interior, a sound that turned my stomach. I imagined that watery face pressing its tongue against the seam, tasting for me. "What do we do?" I whispered. The word we came without permission. I did not want to be alone in this. He didn't smile. "We take it far away from any sound of you," he said. "We make it forget. We make you remember you're heavier than water." Together we muscled the dolly under the coffin. The wood creaked, the nails held. We rolled it down the center aisle, the hammer clacking in my hand with each bump. With every foot we moved, the chapel seemed to exhale, as if grateful to be rid of a guest who had overstayed. At the door, the caretaker took a breath and nodded. We pushed into the rain. It had thinned to a spray, a cool veil that settled on my skin like a net of fine threads. The world beyond the chapel was all slick stone and black grass, the path slick with moss. One wrong push, and the dolly would be away from us, the coffin sliding toward the slope, and the sea hungrily waiting at the base. I kept my hands tight on the handles and my eyes on the caretaker's back. He moved like a man who had done this before, not fast, not tentative, but with a certain grim courtesy for the thing he carried. Halfway to the crypt, the radio in my pocket lit again on its own. No hiss, no pop, just a tiny conversational voice, as clear as if my mouth were against the mic. "Claire," it said, "lay down. You're tired." I didn't pull it out. I didn't answer. I let it talk. The caretaker didn't look back, but I saw his shoulders tense. At the crypt door, he punched in a code on a corroded pad. We pushed the coffin inside and set it down against a stone slab that had seen more winters than I had birthdays. In the deep, dead air, the coffin sighed. The caretaker began to nail again, nails in the lids, nails along the joints, nails into the floor. He worked until his hands shook and there were no nails left. The radio went silent. The rain, too, paused, as if listening. "Go home." he said without looking at me. Burn your scarf. Change your voice with laughter and noise. Sleep where it can't hear you. Don't say your name in the shower. Don't say your name under an awning. Don't. He stopped. He was breathing hard. Don't come back here when it rains. What about you? I asked. He shrugged a little. I have a different name in the rain, he said. I don't answer to it. When I stepped out of the crypt, the drizzle had become a mist. The path glistened ahead, pale with early morning's idea of light, though dawn was hours off. I could see my car as a dark smudge beyond the gate. I could see, too, the curl of skid marks on the hill road that I had somehow not noticed on my way up. My stomach turned, and then turned again when I realized I could hear a new sound beneath the mist and the hum of the generator winding down. Tap. Not from the crypt, not from the chapel. From the flower buckets lined up along the fence where rain gathered and fell in tiny ritual drops. Tap, tap, tap. It was patient. It had time. It had my name once and would try for it again. I would forget. It would not. The caretaker raised a hand in farewell that was also a warning. I raised mine back, and we stood like that, hands in the air, two figures bookended on a path between stones and sea. When I dropped my hand, the radio vibrated once more against my hip, warm as a breath. I considered ripping it free and throwing it down the hill, but I knew the sound would follow me anyway. It had already found other doors. I walked to my car. I did not look into the puddles. I did not say my name. I drove slowly and left the window open so the wind could comb my voice apart. By the time I reached the motel, the rain had begun again in earnest. I locked the door, turned the TV high, laughed at nothing until my throat hurt, and slept without dreaming for the first time in 3 nights. In the morning, I shipped an inventory report to the county with meticulous notes and no mention of an empty coffin. I burned my scarf in the motel barbecue pit while the tourists ate breakfast under umbrellas. When I dug into my pocket for a lighter, my fingers brushed the laminated emergency card. I almost threw it away. Instead, I flipped it over and took a pen to my name. I drew a line through it. I wrote anything else. It didn't stick, of course. The ink beaded on the plastic and ran. But it felt like a way of saying no. Sometimes now, when it rains, I think I hear the tapping on some wooden thing I can't see, a patient fingertip that knows the beat of my heart, waiting for a scene. I think of the caretaker's red scarf, blackened by roof tar. I think of water holding a mouth open in a borrowed shape. I lie very still and let my name become something without sound. If you ever find yourself in an old chapel in a storm, and you see a coffin that's empty under a hole in the roof, don't lean over it. Don't listen for the little kisses of the rain. Don't say your name out loud to comfort yourself. There are doors you can't close once the weather knows how to knock. And if you hear it anyway, if you hear those raindrops on an empty coffin, walk away before the mouth learns how to say you right.